Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that Jesus is the Christ, that He's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you'll be saved. If you would like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in our description that will take you to a full gospel presentation as well as how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we still want to connect with you because we want to help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we continue in our study of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, we are in session 10. And session 10 is titled God Honors. And we're going to be looking at 2 Kings chapter 12, verses 4 through 16. So again, this is session 10, titled God Honors. And we're going to be looking at 2 Kings chapter 12, verses 4 through 16. And I want you to think for just a moment if you're a to-do list type of person. Are you the type of person that when you have maybe a lot of things that need to get done, maybe you have a Saturday and it's a Saturday where you want to get work done around the house, or maybe even at your job when you get into work, you know that you have a lot of things that need to get done on any given day. Are you the type of person that does a to-do list, that actually writes down the tasks that you need to accomplish and then uses that list in order to accomplish those? Some people are this, some people are not. Some people like to have that list, and some people even like to really be able to check those things off the list to kind of see the tangible progress. And honestly, some people are not. Some people, they don't want to take the time to write down the list because maybe they feel like that takes away from their productivity, or that's just kind of not how they're wired. And really, one way is not necessarily better than the other. For myself, I am a to-do list person. I'm not always a to-do list person. I generally have a routine to any given day of the week, and that routine tends to be, for the most part, pretty consistent. And so I don't always need a checklist, but there are certainly days where I do a checklist that I benefit from that. One such example was actually this week. I just had come back from vacation over the last week and a half, and as I made my way back into the office, I had lots of stuff that needed to get done. I had meetings that were going to be taking place. Obviously, the school year is starting up, and there are things that go along with that. And because of that, I knew I had a lot of things that I needed to accomplish. And so what I did was I sat down and I took out a piece of paper and I wrote down all the things that maybe I'd thought of over vacation or that I knew I needed to get done. And then I went through that day and began checking off those lists. And that's a great way to get things done. Whether you're a to-do list person or you're not a to-do list person, I want to ask you this question, which is this: how do you decide on what tasks need to be done first and then next and then after that? And what criteria do you use when you prioritize? So here's what we want you to do. As we go through this study, we want you to dialogue back and forth with us. And how we're going to do that is we're going to invite you to pause the video as we ask questions and to give yourself some time to answer those questions. And then whenever you're done, whenever you're done with that, you will hit play, and then we'll just keep right going into our study. So what we want you to do, pause the video. If you're by yourself, write some things down, get a pen and paper, that type of stuff. If you're watching this with your spouse or with your family or with a group, then we would encourage you to go ahead and have that discussion. Pause the video, have those discussions, and then when you're ready, just hit play, and we'll continue on in the study. So let me ask that question again. It says, how do you decide on what tasks that need to be done next? So what needs to be first? What needs to be next, and how does the criteria that you use say about your priorities? So take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll continue on in our study. Okay, so what kind of criteria do you use? I can only speak for myself here, and one of the criteria that I honestly use is, can I get it done quickly? some tasks take more time. And so there's a lot of times where if I have a lot of very short tasks, that's going to depend on where they end up on the list. And sometimes if I come into the office on a morning and I'm not particularly motivated, or I know that I've got a big task that I'm kind of procrastinating on or I'm putting off, sometimes I will do several, 3 or 4 or 5 very short tasks that I can kind of get some momentum going in order to then take on that bigger task. And sometimes I do the opposite. Sometimes I come in on a day and I know I've got a list of things to do, and there's one thing that I really want to do that's maybe it's a larger task and it's a priority. And so I will put those short tasks at the end so that I can handle all this. And then when I kind of get done with it and, maybe a little bit lethargic after getting that done and after lunch sometimes, then I'll have short tasks to kind of keep me being productive. Some other things is obviously deadline driven. If I know that I have to get this done today, or if I have to get this done before I can do other tasks, then obviously that's going to take a priority. Sometimes what will help a priority is how is what I'm doing going to affect others. So I may prioritize a task because I know that someone else is waiting on that. That does happen on occasion, whether it's preparing for a business meeting or working in our camp ministries or our collegiate ministries here at Tunnel Hill, and also over at the ECTC. Sometimes I will prioritize one thing because I know that there is someone somewhere who is waiting on that information, and they can't start working until they have that information, and so I'll prioritize that. So there are some reasons that I prioritize. Today's session is going to help us better understand how God honors people who demonstrate priorities, or demonstrate how priorities reflect His priorities. So what we're saying there is we're going to look at our passage and realize how God honors and God takes care of or blesses those who put the same priorities in the right spot as He does. And so let's get into our text and begin to understand that. We're going to start in 2 Kings chapter 12 in verse 8. And as we do so, we're going to be introduced to a guy named Joash. And Joash is an interesting story. He is a king in Judah. So he's in Jerusalem, and he has access to the temple. The temple is where he is. His great-great-great-great-grandfather was, probably not that many greats, was Solomon, who had built the temple. He is there a couple hundred, 100 years plus after the temple had been built, and he's going to be addressing some issues in the temple. He was an interesting story if you want to go back and read it, because Joash's father died, and essentially his grandmother took over the throne, but she kind of wanted to take over the throne and pass it on to her family, not necessarily her husband's family or his bloodline. And so when she kind of came into power in Judah, Joash's life was in jeopardy. He was still a child, and his grandmother wanted to eradicate that bloodline, and so he was in danger. And what ended up happening was the high priest, who we're going to meet in our study today, actually took him and kept him hidden and allowed him to grow up enough so that when she died or when he was ready, he was able to take the throne. And in doing so, the line of David was allowed to continue on. And so he had lived the first part of his life with the priest, maybe even in the temple and near that, and was really probably sheltered. And people probably assumed that this young man was a Levite, was one of their children, when in reality he was the rightful heir to the throne in Judah. And so he then came to power. Grandma went away, and you can read all about that yourself. And now he is really setting out to not only follow God, but to, what we'll see in our text, is to restore the temple. That the temple had fallen under disarray, and he set out to restore it. And I say all of that to allow us to jump in to chapter 12, verse 4, and we're going to read verses 4 through 8. And as we do so, I want you to listen for how the initial plan of repairing the temple worked. So let's look into this, jumping into verse 4. Then Joash said to the priests, "All the dedicated silver brought to the Lord's temple, census silver, silver from vows, and all silver voluntarily given for the Lord's temple, each priest is to take it from his assessor and repair whatever damage is found in the temple. But By the 23rd year of the reign of King Joash, the priests had not repaired the damage to the temple. So King Joash called the priest Jehoiada, I'm going to mess that up every time, and the other priests and asked, "Why haven't you repaired the temple damage? Since you haven't, don't take any silver from the assessors. Instead, hand it over to the repair of the temple." So that the priests the priests agreed that they would receive the silver from the people, but they would not be the ones to repair the temple's damage. So the initial plan was, as we can kind of read from the text, the initial plan was that people were going to give offerings, and notice that he kind of lists out 3 offerings here that people are going to do. He said, he talked about the priests. He said there's going to be census silver. That silver that kind of everybody puts in as part of kind of knowing that they're there and keeping a census. Silver from vows, which these are people who, for one reason or another, made a vow to God that said, "God, if if you do this, I'm going to do this. And once this is all done, once this is all happened, I'm going to pay a vow. I'm gonna pay you back for your grace and for what happens there." And then lastly, there was just free will offerings, those who just gave of their silver voluntarily. It's like all that silver is going to go to the assessors, go to kind of the bookkeepers, the people that are going to take that silver and measure out how much it's worth. And this could have been because of weight or the purity of the silver or whatever. But these were going to be people that kind of like organized the silver for the use of buying and selling and those type of things. And he said these people are going to give these three gifts or these 3 offerings to the church, and the assessor is going to have it. And then when you see damage in the sanctuary or in the temple, you will go to these people, get the money you need, and you're going to fix those necessary repairs. Okay, so this is the plan. And they set aside the plan, and then suddenly we come to the 23rd year of Joash's reign. Now, we don't know for sure at what point he kind of made this agreement with the priest. We don't really know that. It seems to indicate that this was a decree relatively early in his reign, so we could think of maybe the 1st year, maybe through to the 5th year. And that's pure speculation, understand that. But nevertheless, what we see kind of happening here is they make this plan. We're going to collect the silver. Then when you see a need, you're going to go ask for the silver to fix that, and you're going to get it fixed. And then we see 10, maybe 20 years down the road, the king comes into the temple to worship. The king is checking out the situation within the temple, and nothing has changed. They haven't repaired things. Still things look just as run down and as messed up as they did before. And he calls them to account. He says, "Hey, nothing's changed. Everything looks the exact same way it did before." When you think about this, I want to ask this question. It kind of relates to all this. It says, what potential problems existed with the plan in place, and what are the strengths of the plan for getting the repairs financed? So if we take his plan and we recognize what happened, what were the positives and what were the negatives? Well, I think first off, the positives would be that they had money. The money was there. The people were giving. The generosity of the people was not the problem. That wasn't an issue. They had a plan, and they had assessors in place, and they had the gifts that they were going to designate for this purpose. They had a plan, and the plan to bring the money into the temple for the repair of the temple. The plan broke down with it was entrusted wholly to the priest to recognize the needs and then to go about doing it. Well, we don't really know why the priest didn't end up doing it. And there could be a lot of reasons why. One reason might have been that they were busy doing priestly duties. And so they were focused more on their sacrifices and the rituals and cleanliness and showbread and all of the other things that they never looked up enough to start noticing repairs. In fact, if we think about, you're in there and you're offering sacrifices and offering prayers and showbread and oil, and you're doing all these things, and you're very, very focused on making sure that you are worshiping God properly, it would be almost in ministry, doing the work of the priest properly, that to look up and start saying, that pillar over there needs repair, might even be considered some sort of act against God, that you're not taking it seriously, that you're almost treating God and breaking the second commandment and treating God in like a vain or flippant manner because you're looking at the building and not paying attention to the worship that you're performing. So that could have had something to do with it. It could have been just the ignorance of them. They didn't know what needed to be done. So they didn't know. They'd look at it and they'd say, yeah, we need to fix that, but I don't know how much that costs. I don't know who to ask for that. I don't know what kind of stuff that needs. I don't know if me trying to do something will make it worse. And so it's better for me not to do it. Or it could have also been that they were so used to the condition of the temple that they didn't see it. That this is just the way things are. I think that happens a lot in our world today, whereas as people get very comfortable in a church building, they start to not really see the problems that are there. They don't recognize that water coming into the building, or heat or air conditioning escaping the building, or cobwebs, or things that are falling into disrepair. They don't see them because they happen gradually over time, and so they don't actually notice that, hey, this is a problem. I actually heard a story not that long ago about a pastor who grew up in a fairly small town, and then he moved away from that town, went to seminary, pastored a church, and after many, many years, he came home to visit his mom. And it's not that he didn't come home to visit his mom regularly, but for the first time in a while, he had some free time, and so he went into town, because he lived out in the country, to just walk around the town he grew up in. Well, as he walked around his town, he began to notice that, the downtown area of this small town had fallen into disrepair, that the roads weren't very good, that most of the shops were closed down now, and that the center of town, of the town he grew up in, had really kind of become a ghost town. And as he went home after that, and he asked his mother, he said, "What happened to our town? What happened so that suddenly it's like the way it's fallen on such hard times?" And his mom kind of said, "Well, it's always been that way." Well, it hadn't always been that way, but she had watched the gradual decline of the town over decades and never really noticed that what used to be, a downtown full of shops and things to do had turned into a ghost town. And I think that could also have something to do with the priests, is that they weren't seeing the repairs, and so they weren't asking for the money to have it repaired. So what we see happening is we have probably the wrong people assessing the need, and along with that, even though we have the money and we have the resources to do it, we don't have the right people in place to assess the need and to put things out, and that those people, their priorities are not in the building. And that doesn't mean that their priorities are wrong. It just means that their priorities are more focused elsewhere. Because of that, the priests and them come back together and decide a new plan of action, which is going to now bypass the priests and their leadership in that, but instead takes that money and hands it straight to the people who will know what to do, know how to build, and know how to respond to the situation within the temple. Because of this, they all agreed to this, and we're going to see how that plan comes into place. The book asks this question. It says, what factors influence whether we confront someone who has not lived up to expectations? And so let's pause the video and ask this question. What factors influence whether we confront someone who has not lived up to expectations? Take a couple minutes, discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so what kind of factors influence whether we confront someone who has not lived up to expectations? And I think there's a lot of factors that come into that, and one I think is intention. One thing is that if a person is knowingly and willfully denying expectations or skirting obligations or anything like that, there probably needs to be some sort of conversation that takes place to say, hey, we agreed that you were going to do this and you're not doing it, and the reasons behind it seem to be, whatever it might be, selfishness or just being overly self-absorbed or whatever. And so it's not that because you're sick, it's not because you've had major life events and things that were out of control, or it's not because you're trying and just it's not working out for you, but that you're consciously making a decision not to do what you committed to do. That could be a reason. Another reason could be incompetence or ignorance, not knowing what's going on. And those are going to probably still require some confrontation, but it's going to change the way you do it. Another thing in this situation that might necessitate, having a confrontation with someone about not meeting expectations is if you don't, nothing will change. And that's kind of I think that's really what Joash is dealing with here is he's like, listen, and I put this responsibility in the priest's hands. The priests are not doing it. And if I don't make a change, then that's just how it's going to be. And really, for Joash's situation, if he did not have this confrontation, then there probably would come a day where he would be dead. The temple would have all of this silver built up for the repair of it. And because he's gone, now what they do with the silver could not be what he intended it to be to begin with. And and I don't think he wants that to happen. He knows that without confrontation, nothing will change. And so he's willing to lovingly, this isn't about him just going in and reproving the priest, but he goes to the priest and lovingly says, let's create a new plan. Let's change the way we do this. You have to remember, the priest that he's speaking to in this passage is the one who helped raise him and protect him when his grandmother was trying to kill him. And so I don't believe for a millisecond that he did so flippantly, that he was harsh with it, but rather that he was going to them and saying, listen, this isn't working. Let's come up with a new plan. Joash made a new plan for getting the temple repair work done, and Jehoiada and the other priests supported the plan. So let's read what happens there. This is 2 Kings chapter 12. We're going to start in verse 9 and read through to verse 12. And while we do so, I want you to listen for Joash's new plan for paying for the temple repairs. So this is starting again in verse 9 of chapter 12. It says this, Then the priest Jehoiada took a chest, bore a hole in its lid, and set it beside the altar on the right side as one enters the Lord's temple. The priests who guarded the threshold put into the chest all the silver that was brought to the Lord's temple. Whenever they saw there was a large amount of silver in the chest, the king's secretary and the high priest would go bag it up and tally the silver found in the Lord's temple. When they had given the weighted silver, then they would give the weighted silver to those who were doing the work, those who oversaw the Lord's temple. They in turn would pay it out of those to those working on the Lord's temple, the carpenters and the builders, the masons and the stonecutters, and they would use it to buy timber and quarried stone to repair the damage to the Lord's temple for all the expenses of the temple's repair. So now we have a plan. And this plan is very different than the first one. The first one was you collect the money, the assessors tell you how much is there, and then when you see a need, you go get the money and you just get the repairs done. Now we have a more robust plan, and it said instead the high priest put a thing there for people to put their money in, and once they noticed that it was getting full, not only the high priest, but also the secretary or the scribe for the king would come together, collect it, weigh it, measure it, know exactly how much is there. And once they knew how much was there, they would hand it straight to the workers. And so there were people that they had commissioned, think foremen, construction workers, architects, stone cutters, masons, all of those things, and the money would go directly to them. And so these professionals were now going into the temple building under the supervision of the priest, assessing everything that needed to be done. And then as they received money, they set out to do the work. And they worked together and they made sure that the things were getting done that needed to get done. What we see first off in this passage is evidence of accountability. So first off, the chest was put out in a public place where when people put it into it, they saw where it went. It was under lock and key. There was no way for someone to get into that chest and take things out without it being seen and recorded and known by the high priest and the secretary. Notice that you have kind of a dual control here. I used to work at a bank and have worked in a couple of other businesses, and dual control was a big deal when you were handling cash. That one person would count money and make sure that a certain amount was there, and then another person would come in after them and do the exact same thing and make sure those two things lined up, and then often matching it to a ledger somewhere else, so that the sales, so say it was a business, that the sales matched the register, and that the both people involved said that the register agreed that what was in the register was in the register, and what the sales was correct. And so you had this kind of dual control. And what's interesting is you have the dual control of both the high priest, so from the spiritual aspect, from the person that was really very much so accountable to God, but then also you had the accountability of the king's scribe or the king's secretary, who lived in fear and lived to serve the king. Now, this person was probably also feared the Lord also. And so both would take the money, count it, agree to how much was in there, and then when that was done, it was handed over to the people who would actually do the work. Not only do we have evidence of accountability, but we have evidence of abundance, that the giving that was taking place at the beginning, all of the different ways that people were giving, that was actually taking place, so much so that there would come a point where they would say, hey, we need to empty out this chest. And it must have happened more than once, because there became a routine to it where enough people were giving to the repair of the temple that they would have to periodically open it up, count everything, and then hand those things over to the workers. It stands to reason, by the way they word this text, that this was not a small little box, but rather a much larger chest that they were using and so when it was getting filled, it was a lot, and so much so that it was getting the work done, that they were able to do things. It wasn't like it was so meager that they were barely able to do anything, but rather they were able to pay all of these people by timber, by stone, by everything that they needed in order to repair the temple. The book asks this question. It says, how do people's financial practices reveal their priorities? Why don't you pause the video, discuss that a little bit, and then we'll keep going. All right, so how does a person's financial priorities, what does that reveal about them and about their regular priorities? I like what the book says here, so I'm just going to read what they say. It says this: the people's generosity was an indicator of two things. First, the temple, to its upkeep and the proper worship of God had become a high priority to the Israelites. And second, that Joash's solution had worked. And so the fact that they were giving was showing that the people wanted the temple to look nice. They were eager to see an improvement to the temple. They were eager to see God do something great within the temple. Going on, it says in 2 Chronicles 24:10, we find these details. It says, all the leaders and all the people rejoiced, brought the tax, and put it in the chest until it was full. The people gave joyfully and in abundance. And that's what we see in Chronicles. That is a second kind of telling of this story. Let's look at the last part of our text today. Let's look at 2 Kings chapter 12, verses 13 through 16. And as we do so, I want you to notice the details for how the money had been collected and how it would be used. So we're going to pick up in verse 13, and we read these words. It says, however, no silver bowls, wick trimmers, sprinkling basins, trumpets, or any article of gold and silver were made for the Lord's temple from the contributions brought to the Lord's temple. Instead, it was given to those doing the work, and they repaired the Lord's temple with it. No accounting was required from the men who received the silver to pay for doing the work, since they worked with integrity. The silver from the guilt offering and the sin offering were not brought to the Lord's temple, since it belonged to the priest. There's such a tremendous amount of integrity in what's being said here. So first off, we see that the money that was being put into the repair of the temple only went to repair of the temple. It did not go to any other upkeep of temple worship whatsoever. I don't know if this was included in here to kind of explain maybe what the priests had been doing with the money previously, that instead of using the money to repair the temple, they were using it to buy the things or to make the things that they needed for just the regular worship. And therefore things weren't getting fixed. It doesn't really explicitly say that, but it is interesting that they put that in here. But when people put their money into that chest, they knew that this wasn't for candles to be lit. This wasn't for wick trimmers. This wasn't for basins or things for them in order for them to practice their faith. This was for the repair and the upkeep of the temple. Not only that, but people also did not try to take money for the temple from other places. There was certain offerings that involved a gift of gold or silver, like a guilt offering or a sin offering. There was a restitution paid for sins that were committed. And when this restitution was paid and when these sins were committed, that was money that was set aside for the priests. And you didn't see them trying to say, well, I'm giving a sin offering, but I want it to go towards the temple. I don't want to go towards what Scripture says it's supposed to go towards. And so I want to do that. Like I want to earmark this especially for this because that's my prayer. And they said, no, we're not doing that. If you would like to give from the census tax, if you would like to give from a free will thing, if you would like to give because of a vow that you made, then put it in there. But if it is for a guilt offering, if it's for a sin offering, if it's for any of these other things, that does not go towards the repair of the temple. That goes towards the maintaining of the priests and to take care of the priests and to be obedient to what the Word of God says. And so this overwhelming sense of integrity in handling the money is really neat because the money went where it was supposed to go. We see from those who were commissioned to do the work that they didn't even need to keep track of how much they spent on stone and how much they spent for the workers, because the integrity of these people was so over the charts that people didn't even worry about it. They didn't even feel a need for it. Undoubtedly, that is because these are shop people. These are workers that loved the Lord and loved His temple and took personal responsibility for seeing that the temple was restored, that they cared enough about it that they were going to work with integrity and make sure that the best thing that could possibly happen happened. This story is a reminder that handling our money and financial obligations with biblical integrity bears witness of our Christian faith. The Lord is honored as we honor Him with our resources, and in turn, God honors that type of integrity. So what we see from this passage is when we prioritize God and when we prioritize the things of God and when we plan our work and work our plan, not because we want to make a name for ourselves, but because we want God to be glorified, that God will do amazing things through that He will make the money go further, that He will make the work go faster, that He will rally people to see and that people will respond to it so that the work will get done, and we just need to trust Him. This leads us to our last question for the day, which is this: how might a church bring honor or shame to the name of Christ through the way it oversees its budget? That's a heck of a question to leave you with, but I think that's a really good question to close out our time. How might a church honor or shame the name of Christ by how they handle their budget? And really, I would even expand that to how they handle the resources that God has given them. Take a couple minutes, discuss that. Maybe think about how that would affect how you give or how you would participate in our church, even in the area of finances or our business meetings, and then close your time in prayer, and we'll see you at 11 o'clock for Sunday morning worship. We look forward to worshiping with you. Thank you so much. God bless.